Margaret Thatcher was the first woman to govern Britain and the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. Her political and personal style was impossible to ignore. She dominated the work of government in a manner that ensured much of what was achieved would be forever associated with her and her alone. But while our collective memory of Mrs. Thatcher will be slow to fade, how do the changes brought about during her 11 years in power affect us now? What is the legacy of Thatcherism? The Conservative Party manifesto of 1979 had at its heart economic reform, including most notably a commitment to amend the power of the trade unions. During the winter of discontent preceding Mrs. Thatcher's election, industrial action had caused chaos in the country. Strike action in 1979 caused the loss of 29 million working days. By the time Margaret Thatcher left office in 1990, that figure was down to just under 2 million. The unions had been tamed.
When she became Prime Minister in 1979, it was perfectly clear to the mass of the British public that the unions had overplayed their hand. The whole kind of idea of there being a national agreement on policy and what we would pursue had dissolved. She came into office riding on the back of that, riding on the antagonism the unions had created, and was really able to go to town.
The defining moment in her crusade to curb union power was the defeat of the striking miners in 1985, something for which Mrs. Thatcher had long been preparing.
When it came to the miners' strike, I think what was extraordinary was how united the party was behind Margaret Thatcher, and indeed a very large part of the country. Bear in mind that the miners had been on strike over and over and over again. They had been part of what brought down the previous administration. They'd been part of what had destroyed Ted Heath's government. And the whole idea that you could just go on strike and that you could bring the country to its knees was one that Margaret Thatcher was not prepared to countenance. When there had been the threat of strikes in 1981, she paid them off, but at the same time then set up systems to ensure that next time it happened, we'd have them.
Mrs. Thatcher had been fortunate in her choice of opponent, for there were many in the union movement and in the Labour Party who had little sympathy for Arthur Scargill.
He had actually ludicrous revolutionary ambitions. He really thought that the strike weapon could so fundamentally undermine the democratically elected government as to bring it down. And of course that was his absolutely vital and basic miscalculation.
1984, Great Britain. And move the rest of them, get them moving.
The public did identify it as a battle between battling Maggie and rebel Arthur. And, that suited her, and it made it much easier for it to win.
The collapse of the miners' strike signalled a wider breakdown of union power. Where once the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, was a force to be reckoned with, now it was relegated to the sidelines. More significantly, the reforms brought in under Mrs. Thatcher have more or less stayed in place.
After Thatcher, you could never again have a country that was dominated by the trade unions, or one where the strike was the most important economic weapon. That implies that the power resides far more with management, with business. We do live in a free market economy, we live in a free market Europe by and large, and opportunity creates wealth for individuals and prosperity for the nation. That's Thatcherism, and it's now widely accepted. Even Gordon Brown accepts it.
Running in parallel with changes in trade union legislation was economic reform. A monetarist, Mrs. Thatcher wanted to reduce the role of the state in the economy. Working with her Chancellor Geoffrey Howe, she approved an early shift from direct to indirect taxation, together with cuts in public spending. In the short term, this led to a doubling in the number of the unemployed. It was a bitter pill to swallow.
I think that some of our colleagues, and indeed even we, didn't realise just how tough it was going to be. But the condition that was always dominant. If we were borrowing money still in order to finance expenditure we couldn't afford, we had to pay interest rates to borrow it. And the market wouldn't let us borrow more except at higher interest rates. So we had to follow monetary policy by reducing our borrowing. It was really, there is no alternative.
What startled me almost was the fact that it was being done with so little sensitivity to the short-term politics of it. It was a great dash, really, to try to transform quickly enough, to be able to get re-elected at the end of the term because some of the first benefits would be starting to show. That is actually what happened.
If I could press a button and genuinely solve the unemployment problem, do you think that I would not press that button this instant? Does anyone imagine that there is the smallest political gain in letting this level of unemployment continue? Or that there is some obscure economic religion which demands this level of unemployment as part of its grisly ritual?
Mrs. Thatcher resisted all calls to reverse her fiscal legislation. She stuck steadfastly to her chosen economic course. Despite a shaky start, after 2 years the green shoots of recovery started to appear. Between 1981 and 1987, the economy accelerated impressively. At the same time, inflation held at around 5% or less.
I think that her real triumph was economic. We were in a very desperate way in 1979. I mean, really we were going down the plug hole. And due to her determination and her vision, she turned things round. And I think that was quite a remarkable feat. Otherwise, I think we would be in real trouble. And that, I think, is her legacy above all.
By 1990, however, inflation had risen towards 10% and the economy was on a downturn.
Fairly worried, yes indeed. I don't think anybody really is particularly secure, especially the dealers.
Basically had a good time over the last few years, and if it all goes, it goes.
We MPs, we had on our hands a recession, a nasty one. The constituency's economy sort of fell off the cliff in 1989, 1990. Housing market collapsed and there was big trouble.
Opinion is divided as to whether Britain would have fared better or worse during the global economic recession as a result of the earlier reforms presided over by Mrs. Thatcher. But another aspect of her economic strategy has stood the test of time: privatisation.
During Margaret Thatcher's time, I think we privatised pretty successfully, and the outcome has been some very important international businesses which have done very, very well.
Mrs. Thatcher considered privatisation as fundamental to improving Britain's economy and, as she would later recall, a central means of reversing the corrosive and corrupting effects of socialism. Her plans met with very little resistance. Once privatised, the old state monopolies became far more efficient and profitable. Such was their success, even Labour rejected the idea of re-nationalisation.
The ones we've privatised since, like British Rail, not been quite such a success. And my own feeling was that Margaret had a pretty shrewd idea of what would work and what would not work, and that she was not actually prepared to bring to the fore. Perhaps we should have listened to her more.
Privatisation also paved the way for deregulation in the City of London, the so-called Big Bang of October 1986.
The basic idea was that if you free it up, Britain can compete in the world, and Britain can also be a place where people from all over the world come to compete. And this was essentially fulfilled. And so it's economic liberalisation, it's trade union reform, and it's privatisation. And suddenly we are an open market, and we're an open society. And that has huge cultural consequences, economic consequences, social consequences, some of which, make very good satire about yuppies and so forth, but which undoubtedly created an enormous increase in freedom and prosperity.
Privatisation led to a trebling in the number of people who held shares. Together with the sale of 1 million council houses, this represented a huge expansion in property ownership.